Pastor Temple, it is a privilege and honor to be here today with you. I've heard a lot about your church, this congregation, over the years, and it's my first time to see you face to face, and you have already fulfilled all of my fondest expectations. So very glad to see all of you. I want to bring you greetings from the church in Jerusalem, the community of believers in Jesus. It's a very diverse community, worldwide community, represents the historic traditions of the Christian faith from the Byzantine period all the way up to today. A very diverse community. All the languages of the world. When our students come and ask what kind of church experience they can expect to have in Jerusalem, I say, everything except what you're used to back home. And they connect up as well with the living, breathing community of God in the Holy City. The particular congregation that my wife and I and our two children, when they were still with us before they've come back to the States, attend on the eastern side of the city, a congregation I think that represents the possibilities there. A small congregation. On a good Sunday, we'll have maybe 20 or 25 people total, but from all 6 continents we have, including locals from Jerusalem itself. And together, we're involved, all of us, in one kind of Christian ministry or another in the city in Bethlehem. And the word does go forth out of Jerusalem. And according to the book of Acts, does end up at the outermost parts of the earth, which include the great city of Sugar Land and beyond. And you're part of that call that Jesus has. And I'm very happy to see you today, this morning. And I'm also here on Armistice Day, Veterans Day, celebrated both today and tomorrow. I'm reminded my grandfather, John, was in the Army, U.S. Army, on the front lines in eastern France, 1917, 1918. He kept a diary and wrote letters home, and we have copies of those and are able to track not only his day-to-day activities, but where he went. 10 years ago, my wife and I took our 2 children and tracked a bit some of the places where he talked about the shells going over and couldn't sleep at night because it was too cold in the tent and all of this stuff. And went to some of these places. We wanted to both witness it ourselves firsthand, the memory of those events, and have our children as well sense some of that legacy that he had. For his diary entry on the 11th of November, 1918, 100 years ago, it was a Monday, 100 years ago, he said something about, we hear that an armistice is being signed, but then he got very local. He said, today I, tidied up a bit, washed my uniform, and I got the truck stuck in the mud as well. So he's interested, I guess, in everyday life also. Very much aware that the struggle to defend the values and the rights that we have for our communities, especially for our community of believers, actually begins at home. Might be fought for on the far-off battlefield, but it begins at home as well. And after he left the Army, came back to his family homestead in north central Illinois, where the ground is as flat as it is right here. And you can see forever. And I think if you stand on the high point, we can see each other maybe. The ground so flat in between. And ended up being involved in the community, even though he was a dirt farmer, involved in the community, ended up being the chairman of the school board, built the school building that I went to as an elementary kid. And his father gave an acre of our land so that the Evangelical United Brethren Church in our town could have a place to meet and worship. And as I think some of you remember, the EUB Church joined with the Methodists back in 1968, April of 68. And I have Methodist roots as a result. The struggle to defend the values, to be who we are, begins at home. The Jerusalem community of believers in Jesus, of which I am also a part, is embedded in a much larger and much more diverse community. Just about any ideology or agenda or reason for being that you can imagine on the face of this globe can be found somewhere in Jerusalem. Just walk down the street, you'll meet people of all kinds of colorful dress and manner of way of life and so on. And we're embedded, we're not a big community, small, just a small percentage of the total. There to witness to the ongoing power and reality of Jesus. How do we impact a world that needs him? How do we do that? I think maybe the same questions can be asked here. Here at the ends of the earth, yeah? Where do we see the impact of Jesus in our lives, and how can we reflect that to a world in need? I very much like the theme verse Pastor Temple mentioned to me in preparation for today, that the verse in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, verse 7, has been guiding the ministry and the teaching here for the last few months and beyond. And I like that. I like the verse a lot. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you. The welfare of the place where we are. Seek the welfare of the city that I have sent you. Into exile, it adds. Since I am, for the last 20 plus years, living in Jerusalem, I guess I'm in exile today. I can't think of a better place to be banished to than the western suburbs of Houston. Today, it's a wonderful place. But seek the welfare of the city. The word is shalom. The word translated here as welfare. I like the word. Typically, the word shalom is translated by the English word peace. And typically, when we think about peace, we think about the absence of hostility. But that's only the beginning of what shalom is. Welfare is a good term. We need to unpack that term even more. Life the way it's supposed to be is a good translation, even though that's a phrase rather than just a word. Life the way it's supposed to be. We sort of know what that should be, and we know that we're not there yet. We're not there yet. It's something that is described at length in both the Old and New Testament, the journey, the questing that we're on in order to dwell in a life of shalom. Jesus described it this way according to the Gospel of John: I have come that you might have life and you might have it, what's the word? In full or abundantly. More than we can imagine. The text in the bulletin, Mark chapter 3, speaks about the calling of the disciples. Before I read that and make some comments on it, some context. In the context, the psalm that was read earlier this morning, one of the songs of ascent, Psalm 122. All of the songs of ascent, Psalms 120 through 134, speak about a very tight connection between God and his chosen people, his followers, and the place where they live. For the psalmist, that was Jerusalem, and it was the line of David. But when we run through the New Testament, through the Gospels and the book of Acts, we find that the psalm speaks about God and believers in Jesus wherever they happen to be. Wherever they happen to be. You know, often we'll take Jerusalem, we'll take the Galilee where Jesus lived, we'll see it through the eyes of pretty pictures or poetry or hymns. The stained glass windows in this church are tremendous, yeah? Emmaus and Mount Sinai and a tomb outside of Jerusalem that is empty. And you know what? These aren't just pretty pictures. These are real places. They actually exist. The longer that I'm in Jerusalem, and 23 years is not that long in the end, in an ancient city, the longer I sense that the deep felt needs, what it means to be a human being, the sense of belonging, to have an identity, to find it in family and place, and be connected with God and God's presence in that place that we call home is is something that was felt as deeply then as it is now. And that we can see ourselves, at least the reflections of ourselves, in the people of the Bible. And God didn't choose these people in the Bible because they were the best, or the culture because it was the best. Maybe because it was the opposite. And if we can redeem Jerusalem, then there's hope for the city now. Even hope for people living at the ends of the earth, like people in the good state of Texas, yeah? Among all of us. Psalm 122, the first half talks about what life should be, and the second half talks about how to get there. And this is context for calling the disciples. I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. The psalmist is almost giddy talking about his own hometown. Wants you to come. Wants you to be there. Some of you are going to have a chance next October, and if I'm reading it right, probably this will be the next of many. Yeah? Visits to Jerusalem. Our campus is built exactly on the line of the wall of the old city as it was when the psalm was written. We know that because of archaeological evidence on our campus, what we found. The gate very close by. Standing within, participating within the community described here, a city that is compact together, tight. Not just physically tight, everybody living on top of each other. Not a place for the claustrophobic, you might say. But also tight of jostling identities and agendas of all manner and kind. The security that comes in numbers is also the same numbers cause insecurity sometimes. Just leave me alone for a minute is what we hear and feel often people saying in the city. The distance that might be between our houses and our neighbors here doesn't sometimes hide the same feeling. Just let me be who I want to be, as we're pressured to be conformed into all kinds of other people's molds and ideas. Jerusalem, a city compact together to which the tribes go up, even the tribes of the Lord. This is an ordinance, it says. We're supposed to do it. If you're a Bible believer, and I imagine that you are, and if you want to do what the Bible says, and I imagine that you do, it's telling you to come to Jerusalem. Let's say literally, if you're able to make that pilgrimage, we'd be love to see you. If not, we can read about it and talk about it here. Their thrones are set for judgment, thrones for the house of David. This verse implies that the way the city, the place, the community in which we are living is functioning the way it ought to be. Wouldn't that be nice if that was the same today? Functioning the way it ought to be. How do you get there? Verse 6. We can start by praying for the peace, the fullness of life, the life the way it ought to be for Jerusalem and our own hometowns. May they be at ease. There's a goal for life, to be at ease. Those who love you, may peace be within your walls. Contentment, some versions say prosperity. Contentment is better. Translation of the term, within your palaces. So how does that happen? Verse 8, for the sake of my brothers and my friends, for the sake of each other, in other words, I will now say, may peace, may this fullness be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. You know, we're led to believe, the advertisements on television, everything is telling us the way to get peace, contentment, and security is to seek our own good first. Do it our own way, for my way, for the sake of myself. The Bible says that's about 180 degrees opposite of what it should be. The goodness of life, life the way it ought to be, the fullness of life, I seek that. I'm dedicated to give that to you. Your dedication then is to give it to someone else. And they give it to someone else, and they give it to someone else. It will end up back at me eventually. And together, the common effort is going to build a community where the compactness together is one that reflects the call of Jesus. That's counterculture. It's counterculture. But our message, I think, is such, and I think that we have something to say to the people outside, that we have something for them. That sets the context for the call of the disciples in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 13 and following. All of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, talk about how the disciples are called. The take is a bit different. Each Gospel writer has a little bit of a different flavor on it. I like Mark's. I'll often read this to groups of students, sometimes adult students like yourself. At one of the places, one of the villages, one of the towns in Galilee that Jesus must have visited, we read here that he would send his disciples, or he himself would go to the towns and villages of Galilee, touching and healing and speaking and helping. Very few of these towns are mentioned by name. But based on archaeological excavation, where synagogues have been found, we have a pretty good idea where some of these other ones are. And to sit there and look over the same landscape, it hasn't changed. The shape of the hills, the climate, the feel of the sun hasn't changed a bit since he was there. And reflect a bit on the call to the people down below. I did this 2 weeks ago with a church, a combined group, Singapore, Canada, and Seattle. Yeah? And they felt a bit of the chosenness that the 12 had. He went up on the mountain. He summoned those whom he himself wanted. They came to him. And he appointed 12. You know, he had a lot of disciples already at this point, a lot of followers. Like Psalm 122, talking about the city of Jerusalem, that's everybody. That's just regular folk living in the city, and people following him across the Galilee, just regular people. Men and women both. The list of women disciples is in Luke chapter 8. First couple of verses, Mary Magdalene and others are listed there, people you've perhaps run into as well. Just regular folk. Let's get a name of these here. He said, he appointed 12, it says, verse 16. We have their names. Simon, he gave him the name Peter. Rocky, I guess. Peter means rock. Yeah, Petra. James, the son of Zebedee, John, his brother, he gave them a nickname as well. Thunderous One, Sons of Thunder. Mrs. Zebedee, the mom, I wonder how she felt when they were youngsters in home, kind of bumping into each other and her, I suppose, the whole way. Type A personality as young folk. It can be a powerful mix. Good for Mrs. Zebedee. You know, she put up with it. And such are some of us. Andrew, the brother of Peter, is mentioned as well. Some of these people we know more about than others. Andrew, according to the Gospel of John, was already a disciple of John the Baptist. We don't know, but maybe he already heard about Jesus, saw him as he was baptized by John. Went back up to his home around the Sea of Galilee, northwestern corner, a town called Bethsaida. And look who walks into his world. Jesus comes along and says, come, follow me too. Spoke his language, I'll make you fishers of men. Let's talk about what that means. Philip is called. Names are important. Names reflect in the ancient world identity, values, and who you are. Philip is not a Hebrew name. Philip is a Greek name. Father of Alexander the Great, the guy who brought the Greco-Roman world and language to the land in the first century, the fellow who's sort of responsible for the Roman oppression in the land today, in his day, represents a lot of what the disciples didn't want to have happened, Philip. How much of that Philip participated in, we don't know, but his name perhaps betrays some of that identity. Yet he too joins. Bartholomew, don't know much about him, just a guy, yeah. Matthew has another name, Levi. Both of those names, good Jewish names. Yet we know that Matthew was working for the Roman oppressive government. He's a tax collector. His fellow disciples would have called him a collaborator or a traitor. He had a stigma, a reputation to live down. Interestingly enough, Matthew's gospel, the first one that we have in the New Testament, is the most Jewish of all in the end. The one that reaches most deeply to the Old Testament, tells us about who Jesus really is. I guess he has his conversion moment. Finds Jesus as well. Thomas, we know him as a doubter. we might be better off calling him Thomas the Honest. At least he admitted he had doubts and faced them. James, the son of Alphaeus, don't know much about him. Thaddeus, Simon, just people. Judas is last here. He has a second name, Iscariot. Not sure what that name means for sure. One suggestion is it means a man from the village of Kiriot in Judah. He's the only non-Galilean. He has a southern accent, this guy. Bit of a drawl, maybe. Yeah. He ends up with another nickname, doesn't he? The one who betrayed. That one we'll avoid. Yeah. Just people. Jesus called out of real life. I wish we knew more about some of these folks. Church memory fills in some of the gaps, the early church fathers and so, but just people. They end up speaking prophetically. Now, by prophetically, I don't mean predicting the future. That's once in a while the prophets of the Bible did that. Most of the time when the prophets of the Bible and the disciples and Jesus spoke, they were speaking prophetically, meaning to the needs of the moment, to the heart of the moment, whether it's personal needs or social needs or economic needs, physical needs, to the moment, the needs of the day. Sometimes those needs were met in ways that were countercultural, against the tide. The Gospel of Mark continues, Jesus came home, the crowd gathered again, the masses, to such an extent, he couldn't even have a time to sit down and eat. He was so busy. And his own people heard about it. Those whom he grew up with, the Nazareth friends he had when he was a kid, his family, they went out to take him, to bring him back home again. They were saying, verse 21, he's lost his senses. The guy's nuts talking this way. Yet Jesus knew that the needs needed to be met. And he spoke to the needs of the people. Countercultural, as we read in the Gospels. Let the gospel story unfold as you read it. And he was willing to do that. Now, who are these guys? They're ones who met the job description of a disciple. Now, they're not apostles yet. That's going to be later. They're called out and sent out to the ends of the earth in the book of Acts. But in the meantime, they meet a job description. And I'm going to read it, verses 13 and 14 again. And I'm going to give you all permission to do something. All right? You can take a pen if you want, a pencil if you want it to be a bit more bold. And if you yourself meet this same job description, I'm going to give you permission to write your name in the same list. Let's see what it is. Verse 13. He went up on the mountain. He summoned those whom he himself wanted. They came to him. He appointed them so they could be with him and he could send them out. Let me read it this way. I'll change the pronoun. He summoned those whom he himself wanted. All right, does he want you? They came to him. Have you come to him? He appointed them so they could be with him. Yeah? Are you with him? And he could send them out. And has he sent you out? If you answered yes, put your name here. Put your name here. You're one among the disciples of Jesus, called for a special reason to be embedded in a part of the ends of the earth that badly needs to hear about the message and the hopes of Jesus. Sent for the welfare of the city, the shalom of the city. That implies that we're not there yet, that the fullness of life that God has for the communities in which we live is still something yet to be gotten, still something to strive for. Not there yet. Work to be done, and life can be better. And if you've put your name here, at least mentally so far, you know that you're part of the solution. You're actually part of the solution. The prophets that we read both in the Old Testament, Jesus himself as a prophet, and the disciples acting prophetically, were people who felt fiercely, tightly connected to make a difference to the places they were sent out to be. Now, I've only known you for 20 minutes or so? I've known your pastor and some of your leadership team a bit longer. And I don't know yet, although I can imagine, some of those places where these disciples, the ones I'm looking at right now, are being sent to. You know where you can make a difference. Yeah? I can only imagine. I may never know the specifics. But there are differences to be made. There are needs to be met. And some of those are like the needs that Jesus met to help the physical body of other people. Some of those are needs that people feel inside, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Some of you have talents in one or the other area. Together is a community of disciples. The fullness of life that Jerusalem is supposed to experience can be the fullness of life that begins in the great town of Sugar Land, Texas. Wouldn't that be a great legacy for this church to continue to give? Yeah. The challenge is here. Thanks for helping me be a part of it. My blessings to all.